Hotep World. This your brother Matthew Daniels, aka Ampu, aka the Chosen Few, aka the Real Bookworm. I'm not a bookworm, I'm the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, world, may your name live on forever and may your memory never die. Hotep, cheers to that. No ancient story has been able to capture and hold the imaginations of man quite like the story of Atlantis. Now, I'm not saying that this is the most popular story, but it is one of the most popular stories. Everybody who is watching this video has probably heard the name or the term Atlantis before, and they have seen a movie or read a book that was loosely based on information about the Atlantis story, right? But do you know where the Atlantis myth or the Atlantis story actually comes from? Have you ever heard the authentic or original, rather, the original Atlantis tale, the original Atlantis story? Well, if you haven't, you're in for a treat, because that is what I'm going to present to you guys today. I'm going to be going to the works of a Greek writer named Plato. Now, this is my book, The Complete Works of Plato. Now, Plato is the origin for us of this story. But Plato says that the individual who told this story to the Greek people got this story from an Egyptian priest. Now, I'm not saying whether or not Atlantis is real, right? So please don't jump in the comments telling me that, oh, Atlantis is a myth, Atlantis is not real, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. What I'm doing is I'm taking this well-known concept of Atlantis, and I'm going to show you guys where the story originated, and I'm going to share with you all the original version of the story. This should be interesting to anyone who is interested in the Atlantis tale. Again, we're going to be looking in my book, The Complete Works of Plato. Plato was a Greek individual who lived somewhere around 430 BCE to about 330 BCE. No, he didn't live for 100 years, but he lived to be about 80, but he lived somewhere between that time period. Now, the information that I'm going to be reading to you guys about Atlantis is quite long, so I may have to do this in more than one video, but we're going to delve into it in this video, and we're going to see how far we can actually get in the story. Now, there is actually two works where Plato talks about Atlantis. One of them is known as Timaeus, and one of them is known as Critias. Now, the account that I'm going to be reading from, just so you can do your own research and follow up and look into it yourself, is Critias. So if you look up Plato's work, Critias, you'll be able to find this account of Atlantis that I am going to read. So we're going to start here, and Plato writes, "We should recall at the very beginning that in very rough terms, it was some 9,000 years since the time when a war is recorded as having broken out between the peoples dwelling outside the Pillars of Hercules and all those dwelling within." So what he's saying is he's about to tell you a story about a war between the people of Athens, right? The Greek people, and the Atlanteans. And he is saying that this war took place roughly some 9,000 years before his time. So he's talking about a time period that's about 11,400 years before us right now today. And when he says the civilization that existed outside the Pillars of Hercules are the Straits of Gibraltar, and they separate the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. And Atlantis was purported to have been a series of islands inside the Atlantic Ocean between Africa and the Americas. Okay, so just so you can have some geographical location and chronological time frame to place this story in. This war I must now describe. Now they said that the city of Athens was the ruler of the Mediterranean peoples and fought for the duration of the entire war. They said too that the kings of the island of Atlantis were the rulers of the other peoples. This island, as we were saying, was at one time greater than both Libya and Asia combined. And when they're talking about Libya, a lot of times they're talking about North Africa, right? Egypt is a separate place, but all of the landmass to the left of Egypt was colloquially and generally known as Libya. Yes, there were other nations in there, but when they say Libya, they're talking about North Africa, next from Egypt to the Atlantic Ocean. That's what they're referring to. So they're saying that Atlantis was as big as North Africa and Asia combined, right? And so he says, but now, because of earthquakes, it has subsided into the great ocean and has produced a vast sea of mud that blocks the passage of mariners who would sail into the great ocean from Greek waters, and for this reason, it is no longer navigable. So he's saying that in our time and in his time, Atlantis no longer existed because of a great earthquake and several other calamities. The island of Atlantis, right, which was as big as a continent, sunk beneath the sea, and so it was no longer there. But he is going to tell us about a time when Atlantis was there, and we're going to see how the Atlantis people live, how their government was ran, what they eat, what they did on a day-to-day basis. We're going to actually get a glimpse at Atlantean society based on the original source that we have. In its process, our tale will describe, as if it were unrolled, the many barbarian nations and all the different Greek peoples of that time, encountering them as they emerged from place to place. It is necessary at the beginning of this tale to describe the condition of the Athenians of that age and the adversaries with whom they waged war, their respective power and their respective constitutions. But of these themes, pride and place must go to the condition of Athens before this war. At one time, the gods received their due portions over the entire earth, region by region, and without strife. To claim that the gods did not recognize what was proper to each would not be fitting, nor would it be right to say that, although they recognized what belonged by just title to others, some would attempt to take possession of this for themselves in open strife. But as they received what was naturally theirs in the allotment of justice, they began to settle their lands. So what he's saying was, in the ancient past, what they were calling gods actually lived on earth with man and ruled, and each god ruled over a particular portion of the planet Earth. Now you find this theme of the gods living on Earth, you see that replete throughout a lot of ancient civilizations. They all talked about a time when the gods actually lived on Earth. You also have this theme in Egyptian mythology, in Egyptian records, where they talk about a time when the gods ruled on planet Earth. So they may actually have gotten this information from Egypt. We can't verify it, but they said they did. So right now we're just going to take the story at face value and look at these original sources. So he's going to be describing how the planet Earth in this area in the Mediterranean and the islands of Atlantis, right, were divided up amongst the gods. Okay, so he says, once they had settled them, they began to raise up as their own chattel and livestock, as do shepherds their sheep. But they did not compel us by exerting bodily force on our bodies, as do shepherds who drive their flocks to pasture by blows, but rather by what makes a creature turn course most easily. As they pursued their own plans, they directed us from the stern, as if they were applying to the soul the rudder of persuasion, and in this manner they directed everything mortal, as do helmsmen at their ship. So he's saying that when the gods ruled over mortals. They ruled over regular men, and they did not compel the men to follow them by brute force and wars and act of violence. They did it by means of persuasion, right? They did it by means of persuasion. So people were living under the rule of gods, and these gods were like the governing bodies for mortal men. Now, as the gods received their various regions lot by lot, they began to improve their possessions. But in the case of Hephaestus and Athena, since they possessed a common nature, both because she was his sister of the same father, and because they had entered the same pursuits in their love of wisdom and the arts, they both received this land as their portion in a single lot, because it was congenial to their character and was naturally suited to them in its excellence and intelligence. And they fashioned in it good men sprung from the land itself, and gave them a conception of how to govern their society. The names of these first inhabitants have been preserved, but their deeds have perished on account of the catastrophes that befell those who succeeded them in the long passage of time intervening. So what he's saying is how they understood history is that the gods reigned thousands of years ago. But the time period between when the gods ruled and our time, and in fact Plato's time, several catastrophes and calamities have befell the civilizations of men. And when those catastrophes hit, mankind would basically be resorted back to a more primitive state, and they will forget the deeds that happened in the past before the calamities befell them. So he's saying during their time, a lot of this information was lost to the general people. That's why they had to get these stories from an Egyptian priest who had these records documented, because most mortals could remember the names of the gods and the names of important people in the past, but the deeds, what they actually did, their actions were lost, right? So individuals created mythology to associate with these names and what they could basically piece together of what may have actually took place. So he's saying that these mythologies, the names of these mythological characters are real, and they were based on real individuals that actually lived in the ancient past, but the mythology was mythology of them trying to piece together their actual lives, right? And I'm just going to fast forward to read one sentence. He says, the report of the Egyptian priest concerning our territory was plausible and true. So he's saying that he learned the Greeks learned the history of what happened in their landmass, the Greek where the Athenians lived. They learned this from the Egyptians, because for something that'll take me totally off track, the Egyptians were able to document, record, and remember a lot more than the Greeks, because their civilization survived longer than the Greek civilization. So they not only knew the names of these individuals, they also knew about the deeds, and they had these things recorded in their records. And so this Egyptian priest gave the Greeks individuals a lot of this information about the ancient past that came from the Egyptian records. So what we're going to do now that you have that basic understanding, we're going to go into the description of the Athenian society, right? He says, as for the state of those who went to war against them and the origins of that state, we will now openly reveal its history to you, our friends, as the common property of friends, if we have not lost the memory of what we heard when we were still boys. So he's talking about how the Athenians went to war with the Atlanteans. He just gave, and I skipped that part, but he just gave the history of the Greek people, right, from the gods down to the present age. And so what he's now saying is, now I'm finna describe to you the people that the Athenians went to war with, the Atlanteans. I'm finna describe to you the Atlantean civilization and how they lived back when the gods ruled, and ultimately how they fell. He says, I must explain one small point before I enter into my history, so that you will not be astonished as you hear Greek names frequently used for people who are not Greek. You will now learn the origins of these names. Solon, when he was contemplating his own poetic version of this legend and was inquiring into the meaning of these names, discovered that his Egyptian sources had been the first to record them. Once they had translated their meaning into their own language, he, in his turn, recovered the meaning of each of these names and recorded it as he translated them into Greek. These very manuscripts were in the possession of my grandfather, and they now remain in my possession. When I was a boy, I studied them carefully. Consequently, do not be astonished if you hear names that sound like Greek names. You now know their explanation. So he's saying that when you listen to the story of Atlantis that Plato is going to record that someone else told him, right? He's saying that don't be astonished when you hear Greek names for these ancient Atlanteans, because these Atlanteans had names and those names meant something. And when the Egyptians recorded it in their language, they translated those names into Egyptian names and Egyptian words that meant the same thing. And when the Greeks got it from the Egyptians, they understood the meaning of these names and they translated these names from Egyptian into Greek, but it held the same meaning. So the names may be different, but what the names mean is the original meaning of the Atlantean names, although the names are Greek names, right? And if you saw it in Egyptian, it would be an Egyptian name, but the meaning of the Egyptian name would be the meaning of the Athenian name, the Atlantean name, although you don't actually hear the Atlantean name being read. What follows approximately was the introduction to the long account I heard then. As I said before, concerning the distribution of lands among the gods, in some regions they divided the entire earth into greater apportments, and in others into lesser apportionments, and they established sanctuaries and sacrifices for themselves. So it was that Poseidon received as one of his domains the island of Atlantis, and he established dwelling places for the children he had fathered of a mortal woman in a certain place on the island that I shall describe. So the god Poseidon, which is the Greek name of the Egyptian name of the Atlantean name, was the god that was allotted the portion of the civilization that we know to be Atlantis. Now seaward, but running along the middle of the entire island, was a plain, which is said to have been the loveliest of all plains and quite fertile. Near this plain, in the middle of the island, and about 50 stades distance, was a uniformly low and flat hill. Now there lived on this hill one of the people of this island, who had originally sprung up from the earth. His name was Evanor, and he dwelt there with his wife Lucippe. They had an only child, a daughter by the name of Clito. When this girl grew to marriageable age, both her mother and father died. It was then that Poseidon conceived a desire for her and slept with her. To make the hill on which she lived a strong enclosure, he broke it to form a circle, and he created alternating rings of sea and land around it. Some he made wider and some he made more narrow. He made 2 rings of land and 3 of sea, as round as if he had laid them out with compass and lathe. They were perfectly equidistant from one another, and so the hill became inaccessible to humans. For at that time, ships and the art of navigation had not yet come into existence. So the description of Atlantis is in the center of it. There was a large landmass with a hill that Poseidon actually lived on with his wife, and he had children there, right? And so what Poseidon did is he surrounded that landmass, that hill, that particular island, with a body of water. It was circled about in water. And then around that water, he put a circular layer of land. And then outside of that land, there was another body of water. And outside of that body of water, there was another layer of land. So he was saying was because mankind didn't have ships and that they could not navigate the waters, human beings could not access the hill where Poseidon actually lived and where his family lived because of the design of how Atlantis was created. So Atlantis was created, it was a ringed set of islands. There was a ringed island, there was water, there was a ringed island, there was water, and in the center there was a hill where the god Poseidon lived, right? And the god himself greatly beautified the island he had created in the middle to make it a dwelling suitable for a god. Because he was a god, he did this with little effort. He drew up 2 subterranean streams into 1 springs. One gushed out in a warm fountain and the other in a cold fountain. And from the earth he produced all varieties of crops that were sufficient to his island. He sired 5 pairs of twin sons, and he raised them to manhood. He divided the entire island of Atlantis into 10 districts. To the firstborn of the first set of twins, he gave as his portion the dwelling of his mother and the circular island, since it was the largest and the best, and he made him king over the others. The other sons he made governors, and to each of these he gave the rule over many men and a great extent of land. And he gave each of his sons names. To the son who was the oldest and king, he gave the name from which the entire island and its surrounding sea derived their names. Because he was the first of the kings of that time, his name was Atlas. The island is so called Atlantis, and the sea Atlantic, the Atlantic Ocean, after him. To the twin born after him, who had received as his portion the cape of the island facing the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, opposite what is now called the territory of Gadara. After this region, he gave the name that translates into Greek as Mulos, but in the language of Atlantis, it is Gadiras. It would seem that he gave his name to the region of Cadiz. The 2 brothers of the second set of twins he called Amphiris and Eumon. To the third set he gave the name Meneses to the firstborn, and Octochthon to the secondborn. Of the 4th set, Elasipius was the firstborn, Mestor the second. For the 5th set he gave the name Azaies to the firstborn, and the name Diaprepes to the second. Now all of these sons inhabited the island, as did their sons and descendants over many generations. They were the rulers over many other islands in the Atlantic, and as I have said, they even extended their rule into the Mediterranean as near to us as Etruria and Egypt. So he's saying that Poseidon had 5 sets of twin sons, right? So that's 10 boys. So they labeled the names of these sons, and he separated Atlantis, right? The ringed islands of Atlantis. He separated it into 10 districts, and he made each son a governor over each particular district. And the king over all Atlantis and over the best portion in the center was Atlas, where the name Atlantis came from and the name Atlantic Ocean came from. Okay? Yeah, so basically those 10 sons ruled over, they were the governors of 10 districts, and they ruled mortal men on this island. They had men on this island, and the god Poseidon and his descendants, the governors and the king, they ruled over mortal men on Atlantis, right? The race of Atlas increased greatly, and many and became greatly honored, and they maintained their kingdom through many generations, as the oldest king would hand his kingship on to his oldest son. They amassed more wealth than had ever been amassed before in the rule of any previous kings, or could easily be amassed after them. And they provided for everything that was needed, both in the city and in the rest of the island. for their empire brought them many imports from outside, and the island itself provided most of what was needed for their livelihood. First, there were the mines that produced both hard and fusible ore, and in many regions of the island, they exploited that metal, which is now only a name to us, but which was then more than a name. Ori Chalkos. In that age, it was valued only less than gold, and the island provided all trees to be hewn and worked by builders, and this in great abundance. It also produced abundant animal life, both domestic and wild. In addition to these, there was a great population of elephants. There were pasture lands for the other animals who graze in marshlands and along lakes and rivers and on mountainsides and plains, and there was plenty for them, and for this the greatest of animals which consumes the most fodder. The island produced in addition all the aromatic plants the earth produces now, sweet-smelling roots and greens, herbs, trees, and gums from flowers and fruits as well, and they flourished there. The island also produced the domesticated crop of grains on which we live and all the other crops on which we depend for our food. It also produced the kinds of crops we call pulse, and the trees that give us our drink, food, and oils. And the crop that sprung up for the sake of our entertainment and pleasure is hard to preserve and comes from treetops. It produced the side dishes we offer the weary guest as a relief after he has eaten his fill, and that refresh him after dinner. All of these did that sacred island once bear in that age under a fostering sun, products lovely, marvelous, and of abundant bounty. And they took all these products from the earth, and from their proceeds they constructed their sanctuaries and their palaces, their harbors and their ship sheds, and they improved the rest of their land according to the plan I will now describe. So he's basically describing like a paradise, a utopia type of area. And he's saying that they existed here for several generations because when one king died, he passed the kingship down to his eldest son. And when that king died, he passed the kingship down to his eldest son. And so those governors, those other 9 sons of Poseidon, who were the governors over the 10 districts, right, or over the other 9 districts, they would pass rulership down to their eldest son. And so they prospered. They had everything that they needed. They increased in wealth. Everybody was getting along. They had harbors. They had palaces. They had temples. They had every type of food you can imagine. They had all types of animals, both domesticated and wild. And it was like a paradise type of state. That's why whenever you see stories about Atlantis today, they always show Atlantis as if it was some type of advanced society, because Atlantis in the original tale was far ahead of all of the other societies. Now, I'm gonna have to bring this video to a close on that note, and I'm gonna have to do another video where I go into the further descriptions of Atlantis, and we'll look at some of their laws. We'll look at some of their ritual practices, how they sacrifice to the gods. We'll look at some of their beliefs. We'll look at some of the ways that they had their army set up. We'll actually be able to look into their actual government and their actual society. But for an individual who does not know the original story of Atlantis, I had to take time to lay some initial groundwork, and that took away from some of the time of the video. So be looking for that part 2 when I will be reading the rest of the tale of Atlantis. So just to recap real quick, where we're actually at, the story of Atlantis comes from a guy named Plato. Plato is quoting another individual, right? But the ultimate origin of this story is that they're saying a guy named Solon went to Egypt, and he talked with a priest in the city of Sayed, a Sayite priest, right? And this priest, this Egyptian priest, told him about a time roughly 11,400 years before our time, roughly, when the Atlanteans actually had their island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this island was originally given over to the god Poseidon. Poseidon is the Greek name of an Egyptian god, right? And that Egyptian god is an Egyptian name of the Atlantean god, the name that the Atlanteans actually gave him. But for lack of a better name, we're just going to say Poseidon, right? Poseidon's eldest son was named Atlas. Atlas became king of Atlantis, and the island itself was named after him. It was called Atlantis, right? And even the ocean that Atlantis was in is known as the Atlantic Ocean. Now, oddly enough, in Northwest Africa, there is something called the Atlantis Mountains, right? There is an Atlantis Mountain also in the in Northwest Africa, and purportedly this is the region where the Moors are from. But that's a whole nother video. And how Atlantis looked, just to cover that real quick, how we made it so far, how Atlantis looked, there was a central island in the middle with a large hill on it. That was the seat of power, where the ultimate palace for the king was at, right? Surrounding that was a ring of water. Surrounding the ring of water was another ringed island. Surrounding that ringed island was another ring of water. Surrounding that ringed water was another ringed island. So this is what Atlantis looked like. It was a ring. It was rings of islands and rings of water going down to this central island in the middle where the king lived. Now, this king ruled over mortal men. Mortal men lived there too, but they enjoyed all of the benefits because that at that time when the gods ruled, they weren't violent, vicious, and cruel. They led people and ruled over people with persuasion. So we're digging into the origin story of Atlantis. So whatever you know about Atlantis right now, this is where they got it from. And so I hope I said something that you guys never heard before. If I did say something that you guys heard before, Atlantis, I hope I am giving you guys and shedding some more light on the original Atlantis tale, just so you will know where it came from and you'll be able to understand Atlantis a little better. Before I go, as always, I got to pay a few bills, do a quick commercial. I'm the author of 2 books, right? My first novel that I wrote was Suicide Note by Matthew Daniels. The second novel that I wrote was Thicker Than Water by Matthew Daniels. You can get these on Amazon. Go to Amazon.com, type in Suicide Note by Matthew Daniels or Thicker Than Water by Matthew Daniels, and go ahead and order those books. You won't regret it. Fire fiction novels. If you don't like paperback, on Amazon as well, you have an option to order the ebook version of it. You can order the ebook version of it for just $2.99. It's just $3. So go ahead and order that ebook version. If you're like me, you're a bookworm, you like actual paperback books, go ahead and buy that paperback book. Support what I got going on. My dream is to be an established author and to write for a living and not have to go to work anywhere else. So support my goals, support my vision. If you like these videos, that would be a nice way to support too, to just keep me going and help out with what I got going on. Just order my books, patronize my work. You can show your support by doing that. Just go and order the books. You can also go to my Facebook page, Everything Matthew Daniels, Everything Matthew Daniels, and you can also order my books directly from there. So go get those books first and foremost, and the Atlantis story part 1. I hope you're learning something that you didn't know previously. So to end this one, this your brother Matthew Daniels, aka Ampu, aka the Chosen Few, aka the real bookworm. I'm not a bookworm, world. I'm the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, world, may your name live on forever, and may your memory never die. Hotel, cheers to that. Look out for part 2. Peace. I'm out.